Welcome to People and Profit, your essential business briefing. Coming up, is the global growth spurt over? The World Bank sees the tide turning. We'll speak to one of their top economists. Repealing net neutrality, who stands to win and lose as the rules change around internet access in the United States? And Japan steps in to regulate Airbnb-style rentals, but will it help to alleviate a shortage of accommodation for tourists? First up, though, the World Bank says that growth will begin to slow down from next year. In its latest economic report, the bank has warned that the escalation of trade tensions among major economies could derail expansion further. This as the United States, the European Union, China and others trade tit-for-tat tariffs on steel, aluminium and other products. There are now fears of a trade war on several fronts. Here's what the EU's Trade Commissioner had to say last Monday.
What is happening, we are being imposed tariffs on trade on steel and aluminium for reasons of internal security. I fail to see how the European Union is a threat to internal security of the United States. They are our friends, our allies. And we should address the core issues of this, which is overcapacity in some countries jointly instead of engaging on this. So the situation is serious. It can escalate. We will try to be proportionate and balanced here, but also in defense of the multilateral system, we need to take certain actions.
Well, for more on what the World Bank has to say about the global economy, let's go to London and speak to the manager and lead author of that report, Franziska Ohnsorge. Thank you very much for speaking to us. You've warned in this report that global growth is at risk from an escalation of trade tensions. What are the risks in your view?
Yes, so we do still expect growth to be robust at 3.1% in 2018, but then for it to slow very gradually. But around that slowdown, there are sizable risks, and they come from several sources, but perhaps the most prominent among them are the possibility of escalating trade tensions and the possibility of financial market disruptions. And
particularly, what effect might that have if we do have an escalation? The situation doesn't look great at the moment. So what sort of damage do you see that having? The trade tensions that affect the three largest economies of the world, the US, China and the euro area, would have repercussions for the majority of emerging markets and developing economies, actually for the most advanced economies as well. 62% of the world's economies have one of the three large economies as their single largest export destination. So anything that disrupts trade or growth in these economies is something that will set back growth in other economies as well. We tried to model one scenario of possible trade tensions where everyone just raises their current tariffs to the maximum allowed tariffs under the WTO. And even such a very rules-based scenario of escalating trade tensions would lead to a reduction in global trade of 9%, which is almost as much as during the global financial crisis. Under your current projections, you said you see growth starting to slow down from next year. So have we peaked really in this cycle of growth in the global economy?
Last year was a very strong year. There was a rising tide of investment, trade, confidence that lifted growth in the majority of economies in the world. This year, that tide seems to be turning. There's clear evidence that, at least for emerging markets and developing economies, export orders are falling. Financial conditions are clearly tightening, even though for now, the tightening is most pronounced for just a few markets.
And where does China then sit in all of this? They're trying to transition their economy. Are they going to remain with the growth rates we've seen of recent years?
For China, we expect still robust growth of 6.5% this year and gradually slowing to 6.2% by 2020. The authorities are walking this balancing path between containing financial vulnerabilities and still supporting growth. So for now, this path is well managed. Of course, in this path, there is always the possibility of surprises, that something goes wrong and somehow growth slows faster than expected. And again, China is a very large economy that is deeply integrated in global trade networks, even if not so much in global financial networks.
One of the other issues that markets at least have been very worried about recently is political upheaval in places like Italy. Could things like that pose a risk as well?
Just like China, the euro area is large, and the euro area has a lot of trading partners, important trading partners around the world. So especially Eastern Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, but also Latin America, has deep trade links and banking links also to the euro area. So again, a slowdown in the euro area is what we see as a risk to global growth, especially emerging market and developing economy growth.
Argentina's had a rough time economically over recent years. They've just gone into negotiations for a new IMF bailout. What's the outlook for Argentina?
Yeah, Argentina, the rising borrowing costs for Argentina are just a reminder of what financial stress could look like. And just like the possibility of escalating trade tensions, the possibility of financial disruptions is also something that could derail global growth. It's a risk to global growth. So for Argentina, we expect that the recovery will continue, but it'll be much lower than we had expected in January already.
We're starting to see a tide turning. Give us an idea from your point of view. How much more pessimistic are you this year compared to last year when you look at the global economic picture?
We have actually kept our overall forecast the same, but what has shifted is a bit the composition within it. Clearly, advanced economies are doing somewhat better this year than we had expected, and that's mostly because the US is expected to have much stronger growth this year, 2.7%, because of fiscal stimulus that we had not anticipated in early January. Emerging markets, on the other hand, at least the commodity exporting regions are doing less well than we had expected. Clearly, that recovery from these lows, these recessions and stagnations in 2016 is a bit slower and a bit less pronounced than we had hoped in January.
OK, Franziska Ohnsorge, the lead author of that economic prospects report from the World Bank. Thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Next, the rules that govern internet access in the United States are about to change. As of Monday, the principle of net neutrality will no longer apply. That had stopped internet providers from speeding up or slowing down access to certain sites. It's a change that worries campaigners for a free and open internet. In March, we spoke about this to Mozilla's co-founder, Mitchell Baker. She says net neutrality is necessary to encourage innovation.
If we want more than one or two providers of anything in the world, we have to enable competition. And net neutrality, or the loss of net neutrality, makes it much harder. Because if you're the one big player, you have relations with the network operators, you can pay them. But if you're a new startup with a new idea, that's a very high barrier to entry. And so the loss of net neutrality is really the loss of innovative potential.
So what exactly will change, and who stands to benefit or to lose out? Delano D'Souza is here with more. Delano.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, first up, let's break down what exactly net neutrality is. The aim is to keep the internet a level playing field. Net neutrality also means there are no fast lanes, so essentially your internet provider can't slow down or speed up certain sites over others. In December, Ajit Pai, this man here, the Federal Communications Commission chairman appointed by President Donald Trump, effectively threw out the 2015 rules set by the previous administration. That decision comes into force on Monday. It drops what's called common carrier status from internet providers, which require them to treat all sites the same. Rules on blocking sites, slowing them down or throttling them will be lifted. Consumer interest will still be protected by the Federal Trade Commission, but it can only enforce rules, not create them. Some states are fighting to protect net neutrality. The state Senate in California, for instance, has passed a bill which essentially enshrines net neutrality into law. It goes even further, ensuring internet providers don't charge enormous amounts to corporate consumers and blocks them from offering sponsored content. States like New York, Connecticut and Maryland are hoping to follow suit. So with this repeal, the power has now gone to service providers. For example, AT&T users can watch its DirecTV Now service without using up their data allowance. Watching Hulu or Netflix, however, does. Who loses? Many would argue consumers do, and internet giants like Facebook and Google have opposed the change too. New players also risk losing out. Making it mainstream could be harder now that providers aren't restricted from throttling content, something they've said they wouldn't do. Stephen, back to you.
Delano, thank you very much for that. We're moving to Japan next, where Airbnb has been forced to remove the majority of its listings ahead of new rules facing short-term rentals coming into force on June 15th. Home sharing has boomed in the country in recent years, and the so-called Minpaku law was meant to clear up some of the legal grey area for the industry. However, many are saying that the new legislation is doing more harm than good. Alison Sargent and Catalina Marchand have this report.
As Japan gears up for an influx of tourists ahead of the 2020 Olympics, it's dealing with a major headache: a shortage of accommodation.
Since the number of foreign tourists has risen so much, I find it very difficult now to get reservations at hotels. When I want to stay in Tokyo for 5 days, I often have to move from one hotel to another every night.
In recent years, home sharing on sites like Airbnb has become increasingly popular in Japan. But the rules for hosts were complex and unclear. The so-called Minpaku law aims to change that. But there are fears that by cracking down on illegal rentals, the market may be stifled.
Under the new law, Airbnb hosts will not be able to accommodate guests as easily as before. I hope this doesn't set the bar too high for us.
This law is the first of its kind in Asia and will allow short-term rentals throughout Japan. Earlier regulations only allowed such business in designated districts. Following in the footsteps of cities like Paris, Japanese authorities plan to limit short-term rentals to a maximum of 180 days per year.
The new law will set the trends for normalizing Japan's home sharing market. I welcome it.
Until recently, Airbnb had dominated the holiday rental market in Japan with over 60,000 listings. But at the beginning of June, the site and its rivals were told to cancel bookings made by hosts who hadn't registered with Japan's tourism agency. That led Airbnb to remove most of its listings while it waited for the necessary paperwork. A move that could add to Japan's accommodation shortage at a time when the number of visitors is set to rise.
Well, that's it from us for this week. If you want to get in touch with your thoughts on the stories that we've been covering, you'll find us on Facebook at France24 Business, or you can tweet me at NewStephen. Until next time, thanks for watching.
France 24, 4 news channels in 4 languages, 430 journalists, 35 nationalities, 160 bureaus around the world, a global reach. 355 million households and over 180 countries can watch France 24. 61 million viewers watch the channel every week, and the numbers are constantly growing, with audience figures up by 31%. France 24 online is also forging ahead. Over 18 million visits a month on France24.com. With 45 million videos viewed online, France 24 is a leader on YouTube, while our 37 million Facebook and Twitter followers make us France's #1 channel on social media. To our constantly growing community of viewers, thank you.